Welcome to the Elevate Your Leadership podcast series with U.S. Navy Special Operations veteran, CEO, and hockey fanatic Bob Pizzini. Bob discusses leadership, success, failure, defining moments, and hard lessons learned with guests who are intentional in their approach to leadership. Leadership is a perishable skill. Use it or lose it. In this series, entrepreneurs, industry executives, academics, public figures, and other highly effective professionals share their formulas for success with you.
Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Elevate Your Leadership podcast with me, your host, Bob Pizzini. If you've listened to my podcast in the past, you know that I only have discussions with guests who have brought great value to me and my organization, and I know that they will bring great value to you and your organization. Today's guest is exceptional, to say the least. We have NASA astronaut Susan Kilrain in-house at iFly Virginia Beach in the podcast studio. I'm going to briefly read Susan's bio, and then we're going to jump right into an awesome discussion. Commander Susan Kilrain is a renowned astronaut, a distinguished Navy test pilot and aerospace engineer, and a world traveler. She is the youngest person and only one of 3 women to pilot the space shuttle. She served 20 years in the Navy, paving the way for women. She has flown more than 3,000 flight hours in over 30 different aircraft. She was awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal. Commander Kilrain flew as a pilot of STS-83 and STS-94, spending more than 20 days in space. Her first mission was cut short due to a potentially life-threatening shuttle system failure. That's your bio, but holy cow, Susan, welcome to the Elevate Your Leadership podcast.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
You have, to say you've accomplished a lot is an understatement, but 2 space shuttle missions. What does STS stand for?
Shuttle training system. It's the whole thing. It's not just the shuttle, it's the rockets and the fuel tank and all of that. It's just the acronym they gave it.
Okay, STS, Shuttle Training System. Before we jump into outer space and talk about space shuttles and,
Wait, it's actually Shuttle Transportation System, I think.
Okay, all right. Well, this is easy. Shuttle Transportation System.
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. Let's go back to your youth and where you grew up and how it is you got interested in becoming an astronaut.
I grew up in Augusta, Georgia, and back in the 60s, in the early 60s. I was born in the early 60s, and I had 3 brothers. My dad was a surgeon, or actually in medical school at the time, and we didn't have any money at all. So for entertainment, he used to take us to the local airport to watch the airplanes take off and land. And this is where I fell in love with flying, the idea of flying. I didn't know any pilots or anything, but I knew that I wanted to fly someday. And we just sit on top of the station wagon for hours and watch the airplanes take off and land. And I was fortunate in high school. I won a program that enabled me to get my private pilot's license. And by then I decided I wanted to be an astronaut simply by looking up at the stars. Nothing magical like watching. I did watch the astronauts walk on the moon, but that wasn't the inspiration for me. And nobody told me, and I didn't know, that women hadn't flown in space. A Russian woman had flown, but no American woman had flown in space, and didn't until I was in graduate school. So, nobody told me I couldn't do it.
Okay, so you had probably an enabling environment growing up, I would imagine. So throughout high school, you got your private pilot's license, and then what did that lead to in terms of a career? Where did you go next?
I went to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University for my undergraduate degree, thinking I wanted to be a pilot, get a pilot's license, become a commercial pilot. But before I even got there, somebody recommended that it was going to be too easy academically for me. And I already had a lot of flight hours that I was going to have to repeat, which was costly. So I decided to switch to engineering, aeronautical engineering, before I got there. And I thought that would work better for me wanting to be an astronaut someday. And so I did that, and then went on to Georgia Tech to get my a master's degree in aerospace engineering while I worked at Lockheed in the wind tunnel, of all places.
Good irony there. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute.
And so as an engineer, I knew I wanted to be an astronaut, but then so did a lot of aerospace engineers. And I was kind of bored sitting at a desk every day. And my boss at the time knew an astronaut and put me in touch with him, who recommended I join the military and become a test pilot. And I thought that was the best idea ever. I could fly, I could get paid for it. It wouldn't be sitting at a desk every day, and it would ultimately, hopefully, lead me to my goal of flying in space.
So getting back to, nobody told you couldn't do it. When you joined to be a test pilot, was that difficult being a woman?
Of course, yes. In fact, the first time I found out that there was a difference, like women couldn't do everything that men could do, was when I went to an Air Force recruiter to get into flight school, and they had fulfilled their quota of women for the year. And I was like, what do you mean a quota for women? And at the time, there was the combat exclusion law in place where women couldn't be in combat at all. So they didn't need women pilots. Women couldn't fly everything in the military. And somebody recommended I take a look at the Navy, and they took me, fortunately. And then when I got my wings, I wasn't able to fly much because I was a woman. Test pilot school was no different, but I also had to contend with the commanding officer who didn't have a good experience with a previous woman that had come through test pilot school. So he wasn't keen on taking another woman into test pilot school. So yeah, being a woman did affect the trajectory of my career, but it didn't stop me from getting where I wanted to be.
Wow. So you had some additional hurdles to overcome there. And test pilot school led to fighter aircraft, or what was the progression there?
Well, test pilot school, I first went to a test directorate, which is the normal progression. But at that same time, the combat exclusion policy was done away with, and they opened up carrier aviation for women. And I received a call from an admiral asking if I would come to Virginia Beach and learn to fly the Tomcat, which I jumped on right away. So there were 2 women sent to the West Coast to fly the Tomcat, and I was brought here to the East Coast and went to VF 101 right here at Oceana.
That is interesting. And I think I heard you tell a story previously that you had a compressor failure, or you were flying your airplane and you had a malfunction. Can you tell us about that?
Exactly. So, I really honestly felt like I was being looked at like with a magnifying glass, because I was the one woman in this all male testosterone filled environment. And the commanding officer elected to be the instructor on my first flight. And we took off, flew out over the ocean about 100 miles or so. And we had an oil temperature high notification. And so I had to shut the engine down. And so I'm now one engine in the Tomcat, which is tricky to fly because the engines are so far apart and you get a lot of yaw. And then the hydraulic crossover didn't work. So we were down half of our hydraulics. The weather came in. It was just like we call snakes in the cockpit, trying to handle this airplane. That is my very first flight in the airplane. There are no flight controls in the back seat, so he can't be of any help other than
tell you what to do.
Yes. So anyways, I had to lower the arresting hook like we would normally just do at the carrier. But because of the hydraulic situation, I needed to lower the arresting hook and take a trap at the field, which worked out fine. And in retrospect, it was the best thing that could have ever happened, because nobody questioned my ability to handle the airplane after all those failures.
That's pretty exciting, to say the least. So was all of that then part of your progression to become an astronaut, test pilot and then fighter pilot, or what is that the natural progression, or what was your progression?
Flying the Tomcat was just, a good deal. And if I didn't get to NASA, flying the Tomcat would have been amazing. I would have gone off onto the carrier. The Eisenhower, I think, was already at sea, and I was headed that way when I got the call from NASA. It was the jet training and that I had already had, and test pilot school. Those were the tickets I needed to punch in order to become a space shuttle pilot. There are astronauts of all kinds of walks of life. They don't have to be test pilots. They don't have to be in the military. They don't have to be aerospace engineers. But that was just my path to get there.
Okay, that's interesting. So, astronauts then and now come from all these different walks of life with all these different skills, and you knew that you wanted to be a shuttle pilot. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, and then what is the application process like? Like you just call NASA and say, "Hey, this is Susan. I want to be a shuttle pilot," or how does that happen?
Well, when NASA goes out and puts out a release that they're going to be taking applications for the following year's selection, folks in the military that want to be astronauts have to apply through their military services. And so I applied to the Navy, and then the Navy accepted my application and sent it on to NASA. And then NASA gets all the service applications plus civilian applications and goes through those. And typically they would interview 120 people, and it's over, a week. And now I think they do a phase 1 and a phase 2 application, like you make a cut or something. But at the time it was just 1 week, where most of it's medical testing, mental testing, and then an actual roundtable interview. And I was just very fortunate. I got selected on the first interview. Some people interview 4, 5, even 6 times, and sometimes they get selected on the 6th time.
So they at the end of the day, they still call them astronaut,
exactly,
or I guess candidate,
they
candidate
got to where
anyway.
they wanted to be.
So is there like a PT test? So like Navy EOD, right? 1,000-yard swim. You have to do 10 pull-ups. You got to do 50 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, and then you have to run 1.5 miles in, I think, like 9.5 minutes. It's been a while since I've taken it. But is there like a PT test?
There's not, and I don't know. I mean, all the military obviously would have had PT tests in the military, but I don't think they test anybody for their physical fitness other than medically they're physically qualified. But most astronauts tend to be in shape anyways.
For sure. Yeah. If you have that kind of dream and that kind of pursuit, being physically fit just goes along with anything of that magnitude.
And it's tough on your body flying in space. So you want to be as physically fit as possible when you leave Earth, because it's not going to get any better while you're away from Earth.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So you got a phone call, you were accepted, you report to Kennedy Space Center, or what happened after you got the call and you transferred, I guess you PCS'd?
Well, the first thing I did after I got the call was I bought the bar that night. It was actually on a detachment in Key West.
So, hell of a place to do that.
With our squadron of F-14s, and then also the F-18s were down there as well, and F-16s from next door. So anyways, I was pretty excited. It took me weeks to pay off that bill. And then I think it was another 4 months or so before I reported, and it's to Johnson Space Center. All the astronauts live in Houston, Texas, at the Johnson Space Center, which is where you do all your training and whatnot, especially all your initial astronaut candidate training.
That's pretty cool. A friend of mine, retired Navy diver, he now does the contract diving at Houston, and he sends these pictures out, and and he's a photographer anyway. Mm-hmm. And so he takes these great pictures in that huge test tank with, astronauts in their full spacewalking equipment at the bottom of this. Looks like a 50 or 60 foot tank. It's incredible. So was that part of your training?
It was a little bit. Pilots didn't do spacewalks, so I didn't need to do extensive spacewalk training, but they put everybody in the tank for some training, because it's the closest you can come to being in outer space, or being in space. Underwater is kind of the closest. If you balance your weights right, you're neutrally buoyant, and so it's kind of the closest you can come to being in space.
Okay. So let's go to outer space. You get accepted, you go through your training. At some point, you start flying the space shuttle before you go into orbit, right? Is there like a training shuttle that you're doing flights in, or how does that work?
Well, most of our training was in simulators, where they're just ground-based. Some have motion, some don't have motion. And it's where the training team throws all the emergencies at you that you can possibly have, and you go through all of that. But the pilots also fly the shuttle training aircraft, which is a modified Gulfstream, where it flies the approach just like the shuttle. We put the reverse thrusters out in the air, which is insane because it just throws all this drag out there so that we basically fall like a rock to the ground. And so a variety of simulators. We do get in the zero gravity aircraft once just so we can experience weightlessness for real in 40-second intervals as we fly the parabolas. So lots of training, lots of different ways of training.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And we talked before we hit record, we talked about that a little bit, what it's like to be in those zero-G aircraft as opposed to flying in a wind tunnel. We're sitting here at iFly Virginia Beach, and Susan has flown in a vertical wind tunnel before. So she has that to compare to zero gravity, but in those aircraft, you don't have any like flight control surfaces. There's no relative wind. So you are just kind of floating weightless. Is it a true simulation of outer space?
It's an exact simulation. It's short-lived. It's 40 seconds. But if you put yourself, somehow in the middle, you can't get to the sides because you have nothing to push off of. But it's almost impossible because you have to push off to get to the middle. But and also the airplane we're all free falling. That's the whole point, is we're all free falling, which is the same thing that's in the shuttle.
Mm-hmm.
It's free falling to Earth. It just doesn't hit Earth because it's going 17,000 miles an hour around the Earth. So it's falling all the way around the world. It's exactly like the weightlessness you feel in space. And it's very different from what you do here at iFly or free falling from an airplane, because there's no wind resistance. You're not feeling wind. I was thinking that jumping out of an airplane would be quiet. It's not quiet. You've still got the wind.
Sure,
going
absolutely.
by you. In space, if you could turn all the noise off from the shuttle, it would be completely quiet, dead silent. You don't feel anything. It's just, you just float.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, and you made the comparison to skydiving and flying in a wind tunnel, significant difference there. And the first time you experienced weightlessness, now you flew 2 missions. Your first one was cut short, but were you in orbit, and did you experience weightlessness on that first flight?
Yes, we were in orbit. In fact, we were there for 3 days.
Okay.
Once we got on orbit, I think it was in the overnight period, mission control notice, there was a failure of one of our fuel control systems. So we had to shut it down, which gave us a third less electricity than we would normally want. And we were safe and we were fine. But if we would have lost a second fuel cell system, then we would have not been safe and probably wouldn't been able to get back down to Earth. So we had to come home at that point.
Okay. So, and that brings us to an area that's somewhat delicate, the Challenger disaster. So your missions, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think both of your missions were after Challenger and before Columbia. Is that right?
That's right. Both of my missions were in Columbia, in the Space Shuttle Columbia. So yes, Columbia happened after my 2 flights in Columbia, and Challenger was while I was in flight school. So yeah.
So did the in view of the Challenger incident, did you have any apprehension about, being an astronaut and piloting the space shuttle?
I didn't have any, I think there's part of some people, me included, that when you're young, you're single, you're bulletproof, you have nothing to lose. And it was what I wanted to do. Had I had kids at that time, I might have taken a step back. I don't know. But it didn't slow me down at all. I was more concerned that they were going to cancel the program than I was concerned about, future disasters.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so you flew your first mission, you flew your second mission, both in Columbia. How ironic. And then how does an astronaut how does your career end as an astronaut, or how do you, you decided why didn't you fly it a third time and a fourth time?
Everybody is different, and I could have stayed at NASA. I could have flown 3, 4, 5 times. But I started having a family shortly after Colin and I got married. Not too long after my second flight, a year later, we had our first child. And I thought I was going to be like most of the women at NASA, and I'd have a kid, and 6 weeks later, I'd be like, ready to fly, ready to fly, put me on the schedule. But I wasn't. Colin is a SEAL, and he deploys all the time, as you can imagine, especially starting in during that time frame. And I didn't think it was fair to have a baby and then train for 16 hours a day and then do the dangerous job of flying in space if he wasn't going to be around. And so I asked not to fly for a little while.
Okay.
And they were fine with that. Flying's a volunteer job. And then I had the second kid, and Colin got transferred to Puerto Rico. And I had to make a decision at that point. Do I keep the family together and leave NASA? Or do I keep the kids and go to, be in Houston and fly more space missions? And for me, it was an easy decision. For everybody involved, keeping the family together ultimately was the right decision. But everybody does it differently. I mean, there are a lot of women in the astronaut office. Many of them have kids. Many of them's husbands aren't necessarily co-located with them. And that's just, it's personal decision. You can always stop flying in space. It is a volunteer job.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, and that makes a lot of sense. Similar journey with my wife and I. At some point we said we're going to have children, and she stopped working at that point, and we focused on our kids, and me being in the military as well. There's the moves and complicated pregnancy and all these things that come with twins, but it was a similar decision, right?
I stuck with it. I mean, after I left NASA, I was back in the Navy.
Oh, yeah.
Because I never left the Navy the whole time.
Okay.
And so I was in the Navy when we were in Puerto Rico. And then when he got transferred up here to be CO of Team 4, I transferred up here to Little Creek, actually. Had a third baby. So now I'm active duty with 3 babies, and he's deployed nonstop. And something had to give at that point. And I had 20 in by then. So I retired.
Okay.
And then went on to have a 4th.
Wow.
And then we started moving when he made flag officer. We started moving every year. And it's hard to hold a career that way if you're keeping the family together.
Yeah, for sure. And your husband recently retired. He retired as a vice admiral, a 3-star admiral?
Right. He retired, I don't know, a few days ago.
Okay.
End of February.
Wow. Just a few days ago. So, so we have a NASA astronaut, and we have a Navy SEAL vice admiral. So
our poor kids.
So yeah, that's and from what I understand, from our talking earlier, your kids are off to hopefully good things, doing what they're supposed to be doing. And our twins are 18 now, so I know the challenge. My wife and I know the challenge, and you do your best, and it's all you can do. So, so you went from piloting 2 shuttle missions, transitioned into being a mom, having a family, supporting your husband's career in some capacity, and then SpaceX happens. So were you like, oh, I should have stuck around, or, do you have Elon on speed dial? Can you, what do you think about SpaceX?
Well, I think it's a fascinating study in how to get things done quickly. NASA's huge organization. It's a governmental organization, so it moves at a snail's pace, where Elon's like, I'm going to fly rockets and makes it happen in a 1/10 of the time. I wouldn't necessarily, he's my example of a great leader.
Yeah.
And no, I never wanted to fly with SpaceX, but by the time he was coming around, I also was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, because my kids were getting to the point they didn't want me around every day all the time. And, so I do a lot of other things. I'm not going to fly in space anymore, but doing some exciting stuff that's new for me, which is great,
Okay. And like New North Ventures or?
Definitely new ventures. I mean, who would have thought that I would be a, venture capitalist, but
Sure.
well, it's been amazing. They brought me on for as a tech advisor mainly, and little by little I'm learning the business, and so that's fun. I'm writing a book. I've actually written a children's book which will be released this year, and I'm writing a regular book for adults, mostly geared towards for women, young women. But so those are all new things that I've never done. I'm sitting on a board for TRX, the exercise straps.
There's one about 20 feet away from you.
Yeah. All right. Perfect.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's out in the and there's one 20 feet away from you in this building, and then I've got one at my house.
Yeah. Well, a guy I know who I'd been on a board with before, he bought the company when it was going into bankruptcy, and he just recently bought it, and I'm on the board for TRX now.
Wow.
So all this stuff is exciting, and it's keeping me busy. And now that my husband's retired, if he's going to stay at home, I need to be busy.
Yeah, that's the typical scenario for all of us when we get to the end of our military careers.
So it's good being on this side of my kids. They don't need me very much anymore.
Yeah. No, there's a time when they have to just kind of go out and, figure things out. So that's cool. All right. So you are really engaged. You're staying busy. You've written one book, a children's book, you said?
Yeah.
Okay. And can you tell us about that a little bit? Like why write it to begin with?
Right. It just was, the book came about because I was writing the other book, and a children's book seemed to be appropriate. It's titled An Unlikely Astronaut, because I consider myself an unlikely astronaut. I mean, who would have thought this little girl in, Georgia, not a penny to her name, her family was, broke, and the other things that I had grew up with would one day become an astronaut,
Yeah,
it just
that's cool.
seemed so unlikely. And the message is, of course, if I can fly into space, you kids can do anything you want to do.
That's a great message. That's cool. Is that book available on Amazon?
It is. It's only a pre-order now.
Okay.
You can get it through my website. You can get it off of Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all the usual.
Okay. And
places.
what's the title once again?
An Unlikely Astronaut.
An Unlikely Astronaut, available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble,
And
or
it'll be out this fall, but it's pre-order now.
okay. And then what is the subject matter of your second book?
The second book is about after the Trailblazers. We all hear about the first woman to do this, or the first person of color, or whatever, to do something. And so that glass ceiling is broken, and yay, we're good to go. Well, it's not like that. It's the people that come behind that first person don't necessarily have calm seas, let's say. It can be even sometimes rougher, depending on who came through before them.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned briefly that when I wanted to go to test pilot school, the commanding officer wasn't keen on taking another woman in test pilot school because the one before me hadn't done well, and I was being prejudged by her performance. And so it's not necessarily easy for all the women that come. Once there's enough numbers, then it gets easier. But so it's kind of the lessons I learned going through. I was an engineer, the only one in my office. I was a test pilot. I was an F-14 pilot. I was a space shuttle pilot, all traditionally male roles. And so it's geared towards women that are in traditionally male dominated fields, and how to navigate and get to your dream despite whatever prejudices might be out there.
Okay. So in and around that, and throughout your Navy career and your NASA career, were you in leadership roles, and is leadership kind of inspiring, or within the pages of this book as well?
There's definitely, I think there's a whole chapter on leadership. I was in leadership roles in my Navy career specifically. There's also the leadership of being in the cockpit and being the pilot and control that environment. But mostly when I was a division officer or department head or whatever, that I had people that were actually working directly under me that I was the leader for. But when I think of leadership, the first thing that comes to mind are the leadership lessons I learned, not from me, but from other leaders. You learn, I mean, most everybody learns their leadership lessons and kind of their leadership style from leaders they've had.
For
Good,
sure.
bad, and ugly.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, it starts in childhood with
With your parents.
Parents and
With your
teachers
teachers.
and coaches and
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you learn it from all those people.
yeah.
And so I was very fortunate to have some amazing leaders, and I had some really lousy leaders too. So, I went from one executive officer who he said straight to my face, "I'd like to rank you first of all the lieutenants in the command. However, let's face it, you could be at home having children."
Wow.
Leadership lesson learned. I don't
Yeah.
want to be like that.
Right.
And then there was another commanding officer that I had who actually, when I was in Oceana here, who still lives here, that he set the best leadership examples and really supported and mentored me in my path. He didn't single me out as a woman. So, you'll learn the good and the bad.
Yeah, you sure do. And and that's been my path and my experience, so much so to the point that I wrote a book about it. But the book covers both my military career and now, 12 years in the private sector and
Right.
and what I've learned. And then there's tremendous difference. There's a lot of similarity because human beings are human beings, similarity between leadership in the military and in the private sector. But then there's also some tremendous differences. So, well, that's awesome. Susan, what haven't I asked you that would be of great value to our listeners?
Oh, wow. That's a hard one to think right off the cuff here.
Yeah. This is off the cuff, by the way.
If we were talking about leadership, I would say, the saying holds so true, give credit in public
Mm-hmm.
and give criticism in private.
Mm-hmm.
That lesson I've learned from both sides of it, and as the leader, take the blame.
For sure.
Take the blame of your team.
Yeah.
You're ultimately going to you're ultimately going to be responsible anyway. So you might as well just take the blame.
Yep.
And I
Right.
learned that from the commander of my first flight.
Uh-huh.
He took the blame for a mistake that I made in training.
Uh-huh.
And of course, I still internalized it and was embarrassed and all of that stuff. But he took the blame.
Yeah.
Didn't throw me under the bus.
But you still owned it.
But I owned it, to my team, to our crew, and also myself.
Yeah.
But he took the blame, and I learned a valuable lesson that day about leadership. There's just tons of examples.
Yeah, there sure are. How can people get a hold of you if they want to learn more about Susan Kilrain and more about the books that you've written and the book that you're writing?
SusanKilrain.com. It's pretty easy to remember.
Okay. KILRAIN.
Yep. And, we had talked about the public speaking side of things. I do a lot of public speaking. That's probably the biggest thing that I do is motivational speaking, especially for young people, women's groups, but also corporations. I like to speak and talk about mainly resilience, perseverance,
Okay.
trust, taking responsibility, but yet
Sure.
going after your dream, no matter how many people say no.
Sure. So public speaking, author, and you're just moving ahead. It sounds like I'm going to use this phrase that should be familiar. It sounds like you have a lot of runway ahead of you yet.
I hope so. I plan to live for a long time because, that way I can embarrass my children at every turn.
Spoken like a true naval aviator. So Susan, thank you so much for coming on the Elevate Your Leadership podcast.
It's my pleasure. It's nice to be here.
All right, we'll see you.
Thank you for listening to the Elevate Your Leadership podcast. To contact Bob directly or to learn more about how Bob can advance you and your organization through leadership training, team building, executive coaching, and public speaking, visit robertpizzini.com. Robert, Pizzini.com, and connect with him on LinkedIn.